Afternoon, and welcome to those who may be watching today's recording of today's webinar. It is my pleasure to welcome you to another NICR, National Institute for Congestion Reduction webinar. This one is titled, Is That Route Really Most Fuel Effective? It is my pleasure to welcome our three presenters today from Texas A&M Transportation Institute. Our first, our three presenters are Mark Burris. He is a research engineer at Texas A&M. We also have Jeremy Johnson, who is currently a research specialist, and Maheen Khan, who is a master's degree student in the civil engineering department. So with that, I will hand the presentation over to Maheen. So take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you all for joining today's webinar. So, I would like to thank our funding partners, NICR and Sintra, and I would like to thank MapUp for their support. I would also like to express my deep gratitude to our co-authors, Mark Burris and Jeremy Johnson. So, before we dive into today's webinar, I would like to connect with you on a question that probably crosses the mind of many commuters. Like, have you ever found yourself sitting in your vehicle, pondering whether the route you take on a daily basis from work to home or any other destination is truly saving you fuel? If you have, then today this webinar is going to answer that very question. Is that route really fuel efficient? As you all know, Google has been has added a new feature to its mapping software that helps you to find the most fuel efficient route. They believe that this feature can help them cut carbon emissions by more than 1 million tons per year. To make this happen, Google uses NREL's route energy prediction model called RouteE. So, this model helps predict how much energy a fuel a vehicle uses when traveling a specific route. However, our initial investigation of this routing software found problems calculating fuel consumption on managed lanes versus general purpose lanes. And if their fuel efficient routing algorithm does not accurately predict fuel consumption, the app might be moving travelers to less fuel efficient route or even misestimating the actual benefit. Now, Now, Google displays a green leaf icon when it recommends the most fuel efficient route to its users. And it was found that the app typically recommends the most fuel efficient path when the estimated travel time through the most fuel efficient recommended route is roughly equivalent to the fastest route. However, in scenarios where the fuel efficient option significantly extends the travel time or the savings in the fuel consumption are minimal, Google Maps provides users with a clear comparison of relative benefits between the routes. This surely allows users to make an informed decisions. So, to start with our analysis, we kicked off our evaluation with the RouteE model, which is basically an open source tool that gives you an estimate of how much energy your vehicle will use on a particular route. The NREL model indicated that it included factors like road grade, speed profiles, and road type. So we tried tested three scenarios. The first one was where the car was traveling at 70 miles per hour for 6 miles, and then 30 miles per hour for 6 miles. The second one was where the car was traveling at 70 miles per hour for 1 mile, and then 30 miles per hour for 1 mile, and repeating this cycle for 6 times. And the third one was where the car was traveling 70 miles per hour for zero point 0.5 miles, and then 30 miles per hour for the same distance and repeated this cycle for 12 times. To our surprise, we noticed that all these scenarios reported the same energy or the fuel consumption, that was 0.37 gallons of fuel. So, this indicates that the software was not accounting for at least some speed fluctuations. Route A may be accounting for variation in speed when a vehicle travels 6 miles at 30 miles per hour, and that it assumes a speed cycle that fluctuates around 30 miles per hour. However, the abrupt change to another speed, for example, from 70 miles per hour to 30 miles per hour, which can happen really frequently during peak hours on general purpose lanes, was not accounted for. We then studied the trends on the recommendations suggested by Google Maps. We did this by selecting different origin and destination points, like from Melody Hills to Euless and Dallas, at various times throughout the day. We recorded what Google suggested for the route, including the travel time, the type of lanes it recommended, and we found that Google recommended the most fuel efficient route 58% of the time. And the non toll lanes, that is the general purpose lanes, was the most fuel efficient route 79% of the time. And the toll lanes, that is the managed lanes, were only found to be more fuel efficient if they were at least 9 minutes faster. So, after the initial investigation, the next logical step was to carry out vehicle runs and collect our own data on on speed, traffic conditions, time of the day. To do this, the team selected North Tarrant Express lanes in Dallas. We categorized it into segment 1, 2, and 3. Segment 1 was the Northwest Loop, and segment 2 is the Airport Freeway, and segment 3 is the I 35W Interstate Highway Corridor. We chose our study location where freeways had managed lanes and general purpose lanes running side by side. Also, the selection of these segments was also influenced by the ease of access and the granularity of the data from Regional Integrated Transportation Information System, uh, also known as INRIX. The speed data from INRIX was used to identify the typical speed fluctuations across the time of the day on both managed lanes and general purpose lanes. We then generated box plots displaying the speed distributional characteristics. From these box plots, the research team identified the speeds on managed lanes and general purpose lanes at peak and off peak hours. The graph here displays speed fluctuation on the managed lanes of the northwest loop in the eastbound direction. It clearly illustrates two peak hours, one in the morning and another in the evening. The morning peak hour has slower speeds compared to the peak hour, suggesting that there is more traffic congestion during the morning peak hours. Whereas on the general purpose lanes, we have AM peak, PM peak, but we see significant congestion levels during the midday as opposed to managed lane. So now I would like Jeremy to take here.
Sure. Thank you, Mahim. Let's see if this works. Okay. So my main job here at TTI is running our emissions laboratory, where we do a lot of testing on. And a lot of the testing we do has to deal with collecting in-use data for vehicles and fleets. And so, as Mahim mentioned, part of this project was to collect some real-world data on the segments of roadways that she already mentioned. So the way we did that is we used what's called OBD data loggers. They plug into the OBD port of a vehicle and record data that the vehicle reports while it is operating. The data loggers that we typically use at TTI are from a company called HimData. You can see a picture of it here in the upper right. These data loggers are fairly expensive. $1,000 estimate here is actually probably a little bit on the low side unless you're buying bulk. So they can be very, very expensive. So one of the things that we wanted to do as well was, in addition to using those that we typically use, was testing some alternatives that are cheaper. You can find some data loggers online that are much cheaper. $15 obviously is way below what the HimData's cost. But there are some kind of drawbacks to those. Some of them require a smartphone connection that's shown here, where they don't always record data. So a user or driver would have to get in the vehicle, turn the app on, start the data collection every time they start the vehicle. Whereas the HimData, essentially, it's a plug it and forget it. You plug them in, and every time the vehicle turns on, it starts collecting data until the vehicle is turned off, at which point it saves the data. And it even has the capability to send them back to a server via cellular functionality. So we did investigate some of the cheaper options. One of the ones that we found that looks more promising than others was the VPeak or device that you see there, the blue one in the bottom right. Very similar in size and design to the HimData. As I already mentioned, there are a couple steps required each time you want to start a data collection effort with one of those. And there is some issues, or not issues, there are some differences in how they save and record the data. So the HimData, excuse me, for instance, is a 1 hertz data recording for as many parameters as you want to log. The HimData can also be used in heavy duty, so they can log up to multiple thousands of parameters at a time. Whereas the VPeak tended to store data not on a repeatable level, I guess, as I would describe it. So sometimes there were 4 data points per second, sometimes there were 10 data points per second, and then sometimes there would be multiple seconds in between data points that was just missing or blank. So one of the things that we did then to compare the performance of these two is we bought a splitter. That way we could plug them both in and actually record data at the same exact time and compare the performance of the different data loggers. For this project, the key data points that we needed were time, speed, location being a GPS chip that is embedded in the device, as well as the mass airflow that is being reported from the vehicle. And using these, it allows us to, on a second by second basis, estimate the fuel consumption of the vehicle. We use the mass airflow and do the calculation that's shown on here to get an estimated second by second fuel consumption for the vehicle as it drives on the roadway segments that we are interested in. And so one of the things that we did was we compared the performance of the data loggers to one another. And we also used the US EPA's MOVES model, which is often used to estimate fuel consumption of different vehicles. So here, and then that's based on instantaneous speed and acceleration of the vehicles, which we pulled in from the data loggers. So this is a plot that you see here of one of the tests that we did using both data loggers as well as using the MOVES estimates. And you can see how it varies. I think the next slide, I'm going to jump forward and back here for a second. So the next slide this is just the MOVES data compared to the HIM data logger. And as you can see, it trends to track very well between the two. But one of the issues with using the MOVES model in this scenario is it doesn't really capture instantaneous changes extremely well. So the way that the MOVES model works is it groups everything into into bins, and it estimates the fuel economy or the fuel consumption, based upon that bin. So you can see there's a very distinct line at 0.01 or just above 0.001, where the MOVES model is often estimating at, whereas the HIM data has more fluctuation in it as it drives. So it does track very well, but again, there are limitations, and that's mainly because MOVES was not designed to do that. It's meant more for a fleet of vehicles and population estimates versus single vehicles. So we were trying to use it in a way it's not necessarily designed for. And so now I'm going to go back and see what we had with the VPeak. As we mentioned, the VPeak data often had missing data. It would have a couple seconds where there were not any data. So we would either have to try and interpret that or just not have it in the analysis and the comparison. And it also seemed to have data where it spiked, as you can see here, greatly on different occasions. And so in the end, what we decided to do, or what we used for our analysis, was the HIM data that we were able to collect. And so this is just a table of the comparison of a couple ground truth tests we did. So this is a total of, I believe, 9 runs where we were measuring the distance and measuring the fuel that was actually put into the vehicle, and then compared over on the right the difference between the measured fuel that was actually put in versus the HIM data estimate and the MOVES estimate. But as you can see, for the most part, HIM data was pretty good. There were 2 kind of outliers in there that were a little bit over 10% difference, but even with those in there, the average was about 5% error, versus the MOVES data, which showed 15%. In some instances, it was 25% or more. So this is what led us to use the MOVES data the HIM data in our actual analysis instead of the MOVES data. And I think with that's the end of my section. Mark, I'll let you take over.
Yeah, thank you. So now that we had the devices and the roadways we wanted to travel and check for fuel efficiency, next up we attempted to get a variety of vehicles. And obviously this is a pretty small list. We didn't have a huge budget to do dozens of different vehicles, so we've got a relatively small list of vehicles. We tried our best to get a different variety of SUV, sedan, hybrid, and pickup truck. Ran into some difficulty getting hybrid vehicles, difficult to rent them, and some difficulties with pickup trucks in that the newer models didn't provide mass airflow. When we had the HEM data device, it didn't grab mass airflow from newer model pickup trucks, Fords. So we had some limitations there, but nevertheless, we went out and collected data on those 2 roadways Mahim mentioned. And as an example, we've got the amount of fuel used for our SUV travel. And this is over several runs of the SUVs going on both the general purpose lanes and the managed lanes. And one thing we quickly came to realize is that oftentimes we will not be going anywhere near the same speeds, especially in the peak hours. So it's somewhat difficult to compare our fuel use on the managed lanes and general purpose lanes We did have at least one time period here where we did have very similar speeds highlighted here with the red. And we were happy to see that the fuel used on the general purpose lanes and managed lanes was pretty much identical when the speeds were identical, which you'd expect. These lanes are running parallel to each other. So if you have very similar speeds, you should get very similar fuel use. You'll also notice that the HEM fuel estimate here is generally higher than the MOVES fuel estimate, probably meaning our SUVs are less fuel efficient than the average SUV used to put together the MOVES fuel estimate. But some fairly consistent results across the speeds. But we can quickly see we didn't have enough data. Even with 100 plus trips, there were far too few on a given road in a given vehicle type for a specific speed to do a whole lot of comparison of managed lanes versus general purpose lanes on these full length trips. So RouteE used 0.2 mile increments to do their analysis, and we used their API to calculate the amount of fuel used in 0.2 mile increments. And we thought, okay, we can do the same thing. We have GPS data, second by second GPS data. We can cut all of our trips into 0.2 mile increments and estimate the amount of fuel used each 0.2 miles. And when we did this, we would look at our results from the HEM data, and we looked at RouteE, the API estimated fuel use over those 0.2 miles. And you can see in the blue line our actual data from the HEM OBD unit. Generally, as your speed increased, you accelerated. So you'd have a speed difference. Let me grab, looking over, oh, wrong button. Draw. No, it's not letting me draw on here. Okay. Oh, there it is. So over on to the right, where you see the speed difference in miles per hour, this would indicate a fairly hard acceleration over the 0.2 mile distance. And on the left side of these charts, a fairly sharp deceleration over the 0.2 mile distance based on the average speed of the first third of that 0.2 miles versus the last third of that 0.2 miles. We measured the speed change. And as you'd expect, there'd be more fuel used when the vehicle's accelerating and less fuel used when the vehicle's decelerating. And the amount of fuel used is on the y-axis. And the one I'm marking up here, that's for the average travel speed of 30 to 35 miles per hour on that 0.2 mile section. The RouteE estimate is almost exactly 0.006 gallons of fuel, no matter what the speed changed, where our HEM data obviously showed an increase in fuel use. And I suspect if we did many, many more runs of our vehicles and got a lot more data, these blue lines would be a lot smoother. But because we don't have a whole lot of data, they're rather clunky and disjointed. But you see the general trend. Our HEM data, the real world data, shows an increasing use of fuel as you accelerate or your speed changes for the positive. And this graph shows more and more of the same type of data. The amount of fuel consumed over a 0.2 mile distance based on the average speed of that vehicle over the 0.2 miles. In this case, it's for all of our sedan runs. And you can see in the gray the HEM data. And you can see a great deal of variation in that HEM data, in that even though we're saying it's a constant speed, there's some fluctuation in that speed over that 0.2 miles. Although the starting speed and the ending speed over that 0.2 miles remain the same, there's little acceleration and deceleration during that 0.2 miles. And you see the fluctuations in the HEM data, where RouteE will give you a specific amount of fuel used if you're at that specific speed. And we'll see even more variation if we separate out when our vehicle was accelerating. You see that in red, and the amount of fuel used is generally higher when the vehicle's accelerating and generally lower when the vehicle's decelerating over that 0.2 miles, where again RouteE gave you a consistent value of fuel use. So in looking at this, we thought, okay, we've got enough data to do a test of a concept here. Can we develop regression equations for the amount of fuel used in 0.2 miles for a given vehicle type at a given average speed and a given amount of speed change? If we can do that, we can apply these equations to WAHO data that is available, and in this case, Sintra purchased WAHO data for their facilities, North Tarrant Express, and they have detailed data. It's typically 5 to 7% of the entire traveling population out there, so 5 to 7% of traffic. You have the exact speeds of those vehicles. So we applied our regression equations to these real world data of travelers out there on the freeway based on WAHO data. Our regression equations look like this chart here. We would develop a separate regression equation for amount of fuel used over a 0.2 mile stretch, whether the vehicle was decelerating or accelerating over that 0.2 miles. And you see the slope of the line here generally going up to the right, meaning more fuel is being used as the vehicle accelerated more. And a specific example here from our tables, a specific example of one of our regression equations. And my example has SUV at 66 miles per hour average speed over 0.2 mile segment. It started at 69 miles an hour for the first third, or 0.067 of that 2-mile segment, 0.2 mile segment. And then it decelerated to 63 miles per hour over the final third. So we have a vehicle in this category. It was decelerating. Its average speed was in the 65 to 70 mile per hour range. So we want to use this equation to get the amount of fuel used in that 0.2 miles. So we've got the 0.003 times 6, which is that amount of deceleration. The speed change was 6 miles per hour, plus 0.0057 gives us 0.0075 gallons of fuel by that one vehicle over that 0.2 miles. And we could do that for all of the vehicles on that section of roadway, and then add those 0.2 mile segments of roadway together to get the amount of fuel used over the entire general purpose lane or managed lane on a facility. And that's what we did with the managed lanes on the North Tarrant Expressway for a single day, September 20th, 2022. And in blue, you'll see how much fuel is used by vehicles on the general purpose lanes. And in orange, you'll see the amount of fuel used on the managed lanes. And what we found here, a couple things. The managed lanes, number one, managed lanes were more fuel efficient, especially during the PM peak period. When the average speeds on the general purpose lanes, you saw those dropped quite a bit. The managed lane speeds were quite fast, but very uniform speed. So not a lot of acceleration, deceleration, leading to more fuel efficient managed lanes. Managed lanes were slightly more fuel efficient even during the midday range. The general purpose lanes were in an optimal speed range in the 50s and 60 miles per hour, but there was enough speed variation there, acceleration and deceleration, that the managed lanes that had a consistent 70 miles per hour actually use less fuel. Now, there are certain times of day and certain instances where the general purpose lanes were more fuel efficient as well. But overall, we saw the managed lanes competing very, very well on a fuel efficiency basis. So the NREL RouteE fuel consumption model, the basis for Google Maps fuel efficient route algorithm, didn't account for these speed changes. And we used the HEM data model to gather data on real world fuel use. We looked at Google Maps and they indicated the general purpose lanes were more fuel efficient most of the time. We're not sure this may have changed. They may have changed what they use to calculate their fuel efficiency, but recently we went and checked Google Maps quite a few times, and it was still showing the general purpose lanes more fuel efficient than the managed lanes most of the time. So we developed a new model to estimate fuel use given these real world speed changes. And our real world data and our model show the managed lanes to be more fuel efficient much more often than Google Maps, especially when there was congestion on the general purpose lanes. So what we found disagrees with Google Maps, meaning Google Maps may not be leading people to the most fuel efficient route and actually putting people on more congested routes using more fuel at the same time. So our next steps is to have much larger amount of data and more vehicle runs and a larger variety of vehicles because we know our sample is relatively small. It's more of a proof of concept that, hey, we can get real world data to feed a model to get better instantaneous fuel use information. But we need to get a lot more data, and Sintra is moving forward with this as we speak in Austin with giving a lot more HEM data units to more drivers and collecting data right now. So with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator to help us with questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all of the great information. So I did want to just remind everybody that the how to ask a question. So your question box is located in the bottom right hand corner of your screen. Simply type in any questions and or comments you may have, and we'll read those out loud and get the presenters today to respond. As a reminder, you do have access to the files or a copy of today's presentation in the files section in the box or the pod right above that Q&A box. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of go through these rapid fire. And then the first question comes in. It says, have you shared your results with NREL or Google? If so, what was their response?
All right, quite a while ago, fairly early on in the project when we were getting some results that looked a little off, we did talk with NREL, and they came back and said, yes, our model doesn't include these congestion issues and speed fluctuations. I don't think we've contacted them since then. We do need to follow up with both of them and discuss this, but I think it was only fairly early on in the project we had a conversation with them.
Great, thank you. The next question says, how do you see insights like these making their way into standard highway emission modeling methodologies? Is that from the,
Uh-huh. Uh, I'll go again here, but I'll let Jeremy and Mahim follow up. I don't see what we have here going into large scale emissions modeling. This is what I see. This is for more instantaneous fuel use, for that very quick analysis of which route is more fuel efficient. How do I get from point A to point B? Uh, the moves data that's built on a much larger number of vehicles, vehicle runs, and typical uh, speed cycles, I think is probably really well suited for the large scale models, where ours can take instantaneous WAHO data on exactly what speeds are occurring at this moment, and we can apply that to a specific facility where we've collected data and get the instantaneous fuel use.
Mahim or Jeremy, did you want to add anything to that response? If so, you're currently muted.
No, I think Mark covered any additions I would have to that one.
Yeah, same here.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question comes in. It says, could land contours if, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a could land contours and if somebody, I'm getting a little bit of a feedback. I do apologize. Okay, could land contours and evaluations be factored into the GPS program like this to account for the increased power required to climb up certain slopes or power saved traveling down slopes?
So,
Oh, go ahead, Jeremy.
no, go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
Okay. So in our case, we were in Dallas on fairly flat ground, but and so our data reflects that on someone in these vehicles traveling on flat ground. But yes, I would think if we moved forward with this, we would want to include elevation changes and it depends on how we can move forward with this. If we're looking at only one very specific freeway, and that freeway has an elevation change of 2%, 3%, or something like that, then we can collect data on that freeway, and our data would reflect that specific freeway elevation change of 2 or 3%. So it would only be good for that specific freeway. If we think even broader, maybe we could collect data that gives us the amount of fuel use over a 0.2 mile stretch for a given vehicle type, for a given vehicle speed, and for a given grade in percentage grade. I think it's important to include grade, but it does add another level to how much data you need to collect in order to have an accurate result. Jeremy?
Yeah, so I was going to come at it a little bit of a different angle from the data side, which is kind of where I come in. So there is a way, if we go back to the MOVES model, where the MOVES model does essentially, or can, if you have that data, can take slope essentially into account when it does its estimates. And then the OBD or the HIM data loggers, essentially that's kind of inherently collected as by the vehicle. So, obviously if the vehicle is traveling up a hill, it's inherently going to use more fuel, and that will come into the data some. And the HIM data has GPS data along with it, so you can kind of look at that and see it. So essentially, that data is captured just by the vehicle itself. It's not necessarily tied to elevation changes, but it does capture it when you're recording, or it does capture the impact or effect that would have as you're driving a vehicle.
Thank you. The next question says, have you considered the impact of vehicle occupancy or weight on fuel efficiency?
We have not, and I'd actually really like to try that as well to see if you could measure it, if there's enough difference in the amount of fuel used when you have one person in a car versus maybe three or four. If we could even measure that on the mass airflow, I'm not sure. Jeremy, you have any experience?
So we've had some experience with it in projects not related to this. We did a big project looking at oversized, overweight vehicles like heavy duty trucks. Where we did that, we measured fuel efficiency or emissions and fuel efficiency on vehicles carrying different loads. But for this project, it was not part of the analysis. But we have done it, and I mean, especially for the heavy duties, I mean, it definitely has an impact on both fuel efficiency and emissions. Whether or not 1 to 2 people in a vehicle is going to make measurable difference. That I don't know, but weight does have an impact on it, obviously.
Wonderful. The next question says, how does the analysis consider changes in elevation or slope, for example, in the context of mountainous terrain, which may be already covered from our
Yeah,
previous
that would be
question?
the same
Yeah.
answer there. That
Okay.
our current one doesn't, because we ran the vehicle over flat ground, but we certainly would be interested in including elevation changes.
Great. Can we get the data? Get the data API?
We don't have an API for this. What we have are those equations, and those are available in the final report. I'm flipping back to those. Like the extended version of this, we have. I At this point, they're I think interesting and a good proof of concept, but I guarantee when we collect additional data with more vehicles and more runs, these equations will change. But the report has these equations for all our speeds for all of our vehicles. It's available in the report on the NICR website.
Is the report currently available?
Yeah, it was out there for a while.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. So on behalf of, did Jeremy, Mahim, or Mark, did you have anything, any final thoughts you wanted to share with the audience before we wrap up today's webinar?
Well, thank you all for attending, and if you have questions, feel free to email any one of us. We'd be happy to discuss it with you.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the entire staff at the National Institute for Congestion Reduction, thank you so much for attending today's webinar. I am going to open up the evaluation. If you could take a few moments to complete that evaluation, as the feedback provided is not only important to the NICR webcast staff and our presenters today, but it does help us as we continue to plan these webinars. Our next webinar is actually scheduled for this coming Thursday. Thank you for your patience as we rescheduled today's webinar due to Hurricane Idalia. So our next webinar, as I mentioned, will be this coming Thursday with 3 faculty members from the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida. And then a registration link has been provided in the web link section. So on behalf of NICR, thank you so much for attending today's webinar, and we'll see you all on Thursday. Bye, everybody.